Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Breakfast with Ara. It's great to see so many people this morning and lots of new faces, which is always super. My name is Farah, and I am the Marketing and Communications Leader for Buildings London. A very warm welcome to you all. And so to our speaker. Born in Stevenage and raised in Hertfordshire, Helena took an early interest in the sciences, especially as her father was an engineer. From the age of 16, Helena initially thought that she would like to study architecture. However, after a week's placement at an architect's practice, she decided she would actually study engineering. Told you that was funny. During sixth form, she spent 6 weeks on a construction site in King's Road, starting as she meant to go on with a glamorous location. Studying civil engineering at Imperial College London, Helena spent her final year in Aachen, Germany. Recalling this time fondly, she says it was a brilliant experience as the World Cup was also being hosted in Germany at the time, which proved a slight distraction as she tried to complete her master's. Surprisingly, Germany did not win that year, and actually Italy won the World Cup in 2006. Scoring 5 goals against 3 to France on penalties. Sorry, Benoit. Graduating with her master's in civil engineering, having secured an outstanding achievement award, Helena joined Jacobs Baptiste in 2006 and worked on a number of public sector projects, including Gatwick Airport. Concurrently, Helena was also involved with the Royal Academy of Engineering on its Executive Engineers Programme across all disciplines, nurturing future industry leaders. Seeking a new challenge and a change, Helena decided to apply to Arup and join the firm in 2012. Over the last 6 years, Helena's projects have included the Saatchi building, currently in development across the road, Woolwich Oversight Development, Television Centre over in White City, and University of Cambridge, and projects ongoing with DEFRA. Helena also completed her interdisciplinary design for the Built Environment Masters in 2015. She remains most passionate about total design, and influenced by her participation in sports from a young age, she seeks to build strong teams. So, without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce the very self-deprecating and talented Helena Gosden. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. So good morning, and thank you very much for joining me. Adaptive reuse projects capture my imagination, not only from a technical perspective, but that opportunity to dig into the history of a building. From the mundane to the eccentric, the historically significant to the ubiquitous 1960s concrete frame office, buildings have a life. As Edward Hollis states in the foreword to his book, The Secret Life of Buildings, a building is a capricious thing. It is inhabited and changed, and its existence is a tale of constant and curious transformation. The book is superb, and the statement above hints at the principle that underpins my presentation today. Simply because a building no longer meets the needs of the current inhabitant does not mean that it is redundant. I wonder how many of you commuted into London today. You may well have been doing so for a number of years. Those of us who have won't have failed to notice the changes around areas such as King's Cross, Paddington Basin, and Nine Elms as you cross the river into Victoria. These are all examples of city-level urban regeneration undertaken in a relatively short space of time to completely overhaul the look, feel, and appeal of these areas. They are examples of extraordinary value being unlocked from brownfield sites and, in many cases, existing building stock. This represents the very essence of sustainable development. Against this background, my career has now spanned just over a decade in central London, and I have seen and been involved with a number of adaptive reuse projects across the city, not only at these major hubs. This emerging trend, particularly amongst our commercial clients, for change of use, very often from office to residential, prompted me to consider the topic of conversion potential and technical suitability of our office stock as the subject of my master's thesis. Adaptive reuse has come to encapsulate the process of conversion to an altogether new purpose where the particular function is no longer relevant or desired. This definition was put forward by Craig Langston of Hong Kong Polytechnic when he began his early work in this area. There is a growing body of research centred around some of the major cities across the globe investigating the drivers for adaptive reuse, the facilitators, the barriers, and the tools. At the risk of stating the obvious, refurbishment can offer many benefits. Here are some points worth noting irrespective of the country or city that you inhabit. 1. Refurbishment can offer a cost-effective alternative to demolition and rebuild. In his book published in 2000, David Highfield summarised that capital outlay for a new building exceeds that required for all but the most complex modifications to a comparable existing one. 2. Retention over demolition and new build represents project embodied carbon savings of up to 70%. This was a finding published by Derwent London in their sustainability report in 2012. And we increasingly appreciate the importance of this metric in environmental performance terms. Reducing embodied carbon minimises material resources and associated costs and alleviates longer-term risks around resource availability. 3. Regeneration of existing building stock can engender a positive change in attitudes within communities. This might sound like an obvious statement, but it was a key finding of a study in the reuse potential of vacant industrial premises in the Journal of Property and Research by Ball in 2002. And fourthly, and for me one of the most important factors, is that the preservation of our most significant buildings permits us to continue to live, breathe, and enjoy the architecture and history of past generations. This is a direct quote from another really good book, How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand. So the reasons for refurbishment of this type are clear, yet I just don't think that we, collectively as an industry, adapt as much as we could. I think we're often guilty of lacking the imagination and the courage of our convictions to make more of the splendid array of existing building stock around us. And I would pose the question, why do we not reuse our buildings more? Perhaps it is useful to explore some of the research that already exists. As early as the 1990s, Professor David Gann, Imperial College's Vice President leading innovation, was publishing research into flexibility in building use and the technical feasibility of converting redundant offices to flats in London. He identified a number of technical challenges to overcome, which in fact inspired my research thesis. I reasoned that 20 years later, a new generation of buildings would have been built. Were these technical challenges still the same? The answer seems to be yes, in a way. What I actually found was that building performance is much more of a driver now than it was then. As regulations have become increasingly onerous, and this in turn places more of a focus on aspects such as the facade. Another apparent hub for research and advocacy in this area is the Netherlands, and specifically the Delft University of Technology. Research there is ongoing into the adaptation of office buildings into housing, and there are many fascinating case studies of real projects, typically pitched at the lower end of the market. And if we hop across the continent or across the sea to Hong Kong or to Australia, we see more lateral thinking exercised by the academics, industry, and local government. In Melbourne, research undertaken jointly between the faculties of Science and Technology, Business and Law created a vast database of over 1,000 buildings in the central business district to try to find common building attributes which lent themselves to easy adaptation. So you can clearly see a theme across 3 different continents. There is a recognition of the benefits and a will to adapt, or else why would they bother with the research? But there's also a desire to better understand the challenges, learn from others, and perhaps bring some sort of framework to bear. We live in a world where we're all increasingly conscious of our impact on the planet. I'm sure you all segregate your recycling at home. Perhaps you drive a hybrid car. In our day-to-day work, we strive for various environmental accreditations. We specify recycled aggregates in our concrete to reduce our carbon footprint. We specify green roofs to deal with the runoff generated by our brand new buildings. And we specify solar shading to avoid overheating on our highly glazed new facades. But fundamentally, shouldn't we be asking ourselves the question, why do we not reuse our buildings more? In my experience, adaptive reuse, or refurbishment more generally, is rarely the high-profile, glamorous flagship project of many architectural practices. Nor does it grab the headlines upon its completion in a way that a bold new piece of architecture may do, controversial or otherwise. It does not represent the blank canvas we might want to express ourselves upon, yet the architecture can still make a statement. This is the inside of the refurbished and reimagined sea containers house. Sadly, adaptive reuse has an inherent image problem. From the outside, an adaptive reuse project may look entirely unassuming, and this may well be to its detriment in terms of publicity. I think this understatement perpetuates the problem. This often means that we do not talk about these projects enough. It means that we do not truly appreciate the value that they unlock. And this ultimately may mean that we subconsciously shy away from reuse. It's my belief that a lack of discussion, a lack of knowledge sharing, a lack of talking about and celebrating refurbishment actually perpetuates a reluctance to do more. And I think that we should all be seeking to change this perception. And when we first look at the quiet, unassuming existing building, potentially run down or past its former glory, I think that instead of potential, many of us see risk. This was one of the perceptions that my research sought to explore. To determine what we might do as an industry to start to switch the focus of refurbishment from risk to reward. New build design is highly codified, and the engineer's greatest challenge is very often determined by the limits of the architect's imagination for shape and form. New buildings provide the opportunity for the industry to make its mark. These grand projects have an identity as yet undefined. The question is often asked, how will this new creation set itself apart from its predecessors? Yet with refurbishment, the skeleton exists already. The challenge is often to back design the building, to get into the minds of the original building designers, and to work with that original intent to breathe life back in. We could just give it a facelift and stick a new facade on the front, but that wouldn't extend the life of the body of the building behind. The most successful adaptive reuse and refurbishment projects, in my mind, examine the condition of the building. They treat the injuries and they rehabilitate the decades of wear and tear to refresh and expose the best aspects of that building's character for everyone to enjoy once more. So the imagination and creativity required with refurbishment is not to push the limits of what technology can now build. Instead, it is required to be able to see and to realise the potential of what is already in front of us. Of course, I'm not the only one who sees the potential here. Local authorities across London have recognised that adaptive reuse may indeed offer part of the solution to two growing challenges. On the one hand, in the commercial sector, the demands of tenants are evolving at a rate which almost outstrips the development life cycle of new offices. Certainly, the cycle of redundancy of our commercial spaces is shortening. Advances in technology, commerce, automation, and demands on comfort mean more commercial buildings are obsolete more quickly. At the time of acquiring the site, for example, and submitting plans for a new office block in the early noughties, could one really have looked ahead and foreseen the explosion of tech companies, or the exponential growth of the demand in co-working and collaborative workspaces 15 years later? GVA's 2017 Q3 Central London office analysis picks up on this trend, so it's very much a real issue. On the other hand, we need residential development. The population in London has been increasing since the 1980s, and despite a net increase in the number of dwellings, house building has not kept pace with the growth. In May 2013, the Department for Communities and Local Government piloted a 3-year trial of extended permitted development rights, during which time change of use from office to residential would not require submission of a formal planning application. Some conditions and limitations applied, but the intended effect of the proposal was to support an increase in housing supply, encourage regeneration of offices, and bring empty properties back into productive use. Although there are some exemptions, for example, listed buildings and ancient monuments, the pilot has since been made permanent. Yet, in commercial terms, it is important to differentiate between available and suitable. In business, we do not do something necessarily because it gives us a warm, fuzzy feeling inside, or because someone, government perhaps, tells us that we have to. Inaction is also an option in this circumstance. Or even perhaps because it seems logical. There has to be a viable business proposition. Through my research, I conducted interviews with a small sample of architects, cost consultants and clients, as well as engineers, to understand their perceptions of feasibility of adaptive reuse. Nigel Adey, an immensely experienced cost consultant, formerly of AECOM and Davis Langdon Everest, kindly agreed to be interviewed. He's also the author of a chapter in the book Sustainable Retrofitting of Commercial Buildings. He presents some interesting statistics when looking at projects of comparable sizes, which I will play back to you here. Depending on the level of intervention, it is approximately 15 to 70% quicker to bring a refurbishment back to market than demolition and rebuild. Depending on the level of intervention, the cost of refurbishment is approximately 10 to 75% less than new build. This is quite a broad range. The range reflects a spectrum of work which he presents as repair, remodel and renew with increasing complexity. Furthermore, tax allowances exist for depreciation of assets. In most instances, the higher depreciation rates will be for interior fit-out and consumables such as plant and machinery. In a refurbishment project, if a large proportion of your total cost is represented by these items, then it follows that a larger proportion can eventually be reclaimed in tax relief. So I confess I'm a little bit out of my depth on the cost side, and a holistic perspective is required. Yet to me it all seems fairly compelling. So if we turn back to the technical challenges, it's perhaps useful to consider an example. Let's consider turning our lovely building here at number 8 into flats. There would be many considerations in terms of technical viability. We would need to consider floor-to-ceiling heights, daylighting, thermal performance, capacity of the existing structure, vertical circulation and means of escape, and the list goes on. This list is the top 10 technical constraints, and it was a key outcome from my research. My intention is that this could form the basis of an assessment framework at the very earliest stage in a project. It's far from plain sailing. I know only too well that refurbishment brings challenges and that there are risks. Some of my thesis interviews with a handful of architects, cost consultants and engineers, I would say verged on therapy sessions. Yet the projects which we reflected upon were all hugely successful and highly rewarding. They just required a bit of tenacity and imagination. So imagine, if you will, you are planning a new build residential block. Imagine that it's circular. That's crazy. How do you plan the rooms to fit the furniture in? How do you detail the facade when it's not even faceted, but curved? How does your vertical circulation and service distribution possibly work? It's all going to cost you money, and it's going to be a nightmare to build. But if you use your imagination, you might have ended up with something like this. This is the triplet at King's Cross. Or this. You may recognise the second image as well. It's Television Centre. This is an example of adaptive reuse. The architects at AHMM and the design team solved all of those puzzles and created an extremely elegant solution. Not only does it meet all of the criteria, but it has character and it has history. And apart from anything else, who builds structures with exposed soffits like that nowadays? Now imagine that you are planning a small development of new luxury flats in central London. Imagine that you can't include floor-to-ceiling windows. How do you maximise the light in your living spaces? How do you lay out the rooms to suit the facade? Would you end up with a product that looks like this? This is 65 and 67 to 69 Whitfield Street, which is part of the Saatchi development on Charlotte Street over the road. Make architects and the rest of the design team have invested their creative juices in planning layouts and working with the existing building structure and facade in a conservation area to make the eccentricities of the existing building part of the charm and the value. In this particular case, the financial viability of the project also depended heavily on the addition of 2 extra stories. Because of the limitation of the capacity of the existing foundations, early on in the scheme, the team looked at ways of forming these extra stories in lightweight cross-laminated timber. This was a great example of innovative thinking at an early stage in the design process. Lastly, imagine that you are asked to find a new home for a world-class museum. Many of London's other world-class museums are in South Kensington. Of course, there's no vacant site in this location. You're offered a prime site with an existing Grade 1 listed status. However, it is essentially an office space. The fragile roof is the most prized feature, but what is below is not suitable for curating your collection of artefacts. So what would you do? Push the limits of engineering knowledge to keep that roof in place and build a new venue below. The outcome is a sensational space that might never have been conceived from a blank canvas greenfield site. This image is from the opening of the Design Museum. The architects at OMA with Allies and Morrison and John Pawson, and I think you'll agree, the investment by the team in this project has generated a building worthy not only of the collection that it houses, but of visiting for an appreciation of the architecture alone. However, it's not always about preserving history and character. Sometimes it's the simplest buildings, which are in fact the most flexible in terms of adaptation. This image is of 1 to 2 Stephen Street. Often taking a building at the end of its useful life and repurposing it can result in dramatic effects. 1 to 2 Stephen Street benefits from immediate proximity to the new Crossrail hub at Tottenham Court Road. And in terms of the value versus cost equation, refurbishment over demolition and new build is an easy win here. But you still have to create a product that people will want, and that is where the imagination is required. Each of these examples challenges the norm, the preconception perhaps that refurbishment is a compromise at best, and that the risk outweighs the reward. But it took investment of time, energy, money, and imagination at the outset for a vision to start to emerge. I'm not saying that adaptation and reuse is the right option in every case, but if we let the ideas flow, if we foster an environment at the very earliest stage of a project when real change can be effected with relatively minimal expenditure of time and energy, then we won't miss either the easy wins or the real gems that are waiting to be unearthed. And in answer to the question, why do we not reuse our buildings more? I think there is a subtle undertone to this question, which reflects 2 big issues, that of image and that of perceived risk. With a small sleight of hand, we can rephrase this question, and suddenly the conversation changes, and we start to focus on the opportunity and the potential. So let's please start discussing why we should reuse our buildings more. Thank you for listening. We're very happy to take questions. Morning.
Hi. So we've talked about a lot about the opportunities and the challenges of reusing the building, but new build is always going to happen. So what lessons can we take forward when we're designing a new build?
So I think one of the things to come out of the research, from my experience, from the experience probably of the wider industry, is that the constraint often comes with what is possible within the existing building. Sometimes you have record information, sometimes you don't. I think in a world where we're all moving towards the implementation of BIM on all of our projects, that availability of record information will be less of an issue. But I think building flexibility into our buildings is something which we perhaps should all think a little bit more about. So I believe that under BREEAM, there is a requirement for some of the higher levels of accreditation to consider future resilience to climate change. But I would also like to think that we should be thinking about how we might use the building further down the line generally, what sort of tenants we might have. Yeah, and so I think that we should be thinking about that. But the flip side of that is that as new buildings become more and more kind of refined in the way that we design them, that we iterate over and over as we work with our computer models, there's less kind of scope to build in capacity. Everything, there's hardly any rationalization anymore. Everything is designed down to the nth degree, and perhaps that will prove problematic in the future. So I think we just need to ask ourselves the questions fairly early on. What might we do with this building in 20 years, 30 years' time? I'd like to see that happen. Hello.
Right, it was interesting you used Sea Containers House, because that building originally was changed because it was built to be a hotel, and then I think there was a market crash at the time and it was turned into offices. Mm-hmm. So the fact that it's been flipped back now to a hotel, it's gone back to its original design use. But given the fact that we're in a fairly uncertain economic time, do you think that when you're building new buildings, you need to have that more flexible approach for what the end use of the building may be? Because from a development point of view, you start the project 3-4 years down the line, the economic climate has changed, and at that point, rather than 20 years, at that point you need to be looking for alternate uses.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that you should be asking yourself the questions as early as possible. I think one of the other things that emerged was perhaps with adaptive reuse and refurbishment that we don't necessarily have these kind of brainstorming sessions early on where, I mean, it would be relatively cheap and hopefully cost-effective thing to do just to get a mini design team into a room and have a discussion about these sort of things. With the research that I undertook, I was kind of coming at it from, my background is engineering, so looking at the technical constraints. But the reason then for approaching architects, cost consultants, clients, the other design team members was to understand whether those perceptions of the engineers were shared by the rest of the design team. And actually, broadly, that kind of top 10 list that came out was a ranking that was normalised across all of those. So they were shared perceptions, I suppose. So I suppose my aspiration at the beginning of the research was that you might take that list and use that as a framework for a discussion in a meeting like that. So I think that you could achieve a lot in a relatively short space of time just by bouncing those ideas around.
Do you think there are certain structural designs that lend themselves better to future adaptability? And do you think there are some which actually, whilst in the short term they deliver good value and major benefits, actually when you then, for example, maybe a post-tension slab, when you then come to change it, you've got to take the whole thing down because it's very difficult to adapt it?
Yeah, that is true. But then, so I suppose, I think record information becomes very important in that situation. So in terms of which buildings are more or less appropriate, adaptive reuse in the kind of academic sense, the way that academia sees it, which is office to resi or commercial to resi, tends to be undertaken more often because technically it is easier. So you design an office building for higher loads than you would do for resi, so it's typically easier then to make that conversion rather than the other way. So there's the loading perspective. But the issue with post-tensioning, where you need to know where all the tendons are in order to punch holes through things, I do think it is more complex, but I think if you had a good amount of available record information, I think that would make life a lot easier. Hello.
Hi. You mentioned that you're starting to use BIM on all your projects now. Is it cost viable to do so on refurbishment projects as well?
So speaking from my experience, I would totally advocate having surveys done as early as physically possible and getting all of that information into a model, because this kind of comes back to that question about risk. A lot of the perception of risk is because we don't know what's there. It is a relatively complex process to have the surveys done and then kind of convert it into a Revit model. Most of us, I think, are working in Revit now. But I think the benefit, once you've got it done, is huge. And so I would totally say that's a worthwhile investment.
I was just going to suggest that, as well as the image question, the perception of site capacity is one of the factors that influences the choice of new building or adaptive reuse. We have high land values and an opportunistic planning system. Speaking as an architect who favours adaptive reuse as a starting point, I find the impression you can get twice as much on the side by knocking it down is one of the decisive factors in determining which path a project takes.
No, I think that's a fair point, and I would say it's not right for every site. The adaptive reuse, the permitted development rights example that I gave is kind of across the country, but there are exemptions, and actually when you look at it in detail, some of the very central London boroughs are actually excluded, so there is still a requirement to go through a planning application in Kensington and Chelsea, in Westminster, potentially partly driven by that commercial reasoning, I suppose.
But which is also then where, in a way, you mentioned the project in the conservation area where they were adding 10-15% capacity. What's kind of quite interesting with the conservation area as a tool, as a planning tool, is it permits change, but it sets some limits for it.
Yeah, and so there are a lot of other constraints to consider, particularly in central London. But I think as you start to move a little bit further out of London, so obviously a lot of the projects that I referred to were quite high profile, but actually some of those examples from the Netherlands are looking at generating affordable housing from fairly, I'm going to use the term bog standard office stock. And actually in some of the outer suburbs of London, you don't even really have to go probably much beyond the North Circular to find stock that would be appropriate for this sort of thing. But is it being considered?
It was a really interesting topic this morning. ISG, where I work, we do a lot of obviously refurbishment of existing buildings, not just residential, I would say. More and more we're seeing science buildings going into what were traditionally offices, or even private medical as well. So it's, you know, it's across the board we're looking at reuse. So yeah, fantastic topic, and one that we do need to address. We need to address this as an industry because, you know, we're missing a real opportunity to take, you know, iconic buildings and change their use. You know, we can put interesting science, interesting technology. And, you know, the generation that's coming into London really is looking for that iconic workplace to work in, and that history is fantastic.
It's very tricky because it is, once again, as mentioned earlier, it's about what the site can take. So we've apparently got a project at the moment which is basically just adapting it. So it's a project in Euston Road, Hampstead Road area, and basically it's two 50s buildings which were joined together in the 80s, and they were it was a commercial building. What we've done is we've turned it into kept the office use, but we've also added a market and affordable housing there. And we've also added retail to the ground floor, so as well as extending the back of it. So we've actually added quite a lot of use to it. It's very tricky, of course, because even with the project we've got at the moment, the structure for it is very difficult. So it's often worth the reward for a building of fantastic character. For a building, for example, which the structure can be a bit diabolical and a bit shambolic, it can be very difficult, especially when we have different expectations of what we want in an office now compared to 60 years ago. For example, we were looking at this building now from the 50s and the floor to ceiling was quite low. But obviously now people want taller floor to ceiling, more glass. And the difficulty we had was figuring out if we could allow the expectations of what people want now, again, with a building that was 60 years old.
I think that, yes, that's certainly our feeling as a practice, is that it's a very important kind of tool. It's a very important possibility for, I suppose it has a number of aspects, and I think Helena kind of covered those kind of quite interestingly. I suppose there is a kind of, so I suppose the economic aspects are kind of quite important. I suppose there are kind of other arguments as well about kind of almost like cultural continuity, or and I suppose even institutional culture. So obviously when you get into heritage, there's sort of, that gets defined by someone else, but this sort of sense of, I suppose, the speed of change, it seems to me there are kind of questions where we're constantly hearing, constantly told about, how our economy is changing, and the speed at which we are changing, the speed at which we have to change, and there's a bit of a kind of choice there. Can our buildings keep up? And I suppose the conclusion I've started to reach is that maybe there's a way in which our buildings slow down, so to speak, and that's the way to keep up. Because if we're able to build robustly and durably and then adapt them, that is a better model than constantly trying to kind of hit current, or changing performance targets or idea about economic and social organisation.